Hi, I'm Gail Z and I write epic fantasy, urban fantasy, steampunk, and more. Together with a lot of my author friends, we are in the Anthology Across the Universe, and it's got a nice slate of authors writing stories about who the Beatles might have been if they weren't rock gods. Mine envisions them as something like the Scooby Gang, and this is my complete story, The Walrus Returns. Have you seen the cover of Mercy Beast magazine? The Mercy Monster is back. Paul charged into the small flat, waving the color magazine like a madman. Ringo looked up from the model train he coaxed around a track on the coffee table. He looked a bit bleary, but Paul chalked that up to bad shrooms. Really? He tilted his head like a confused retriever. Didn't know it had ever left. Groovy. He went back to working the controls of the small blue engine, sending it around the bend with an anemic toot. Interesting, John replied, glancing up from the old spellbook on his lap. Its leather-bound cover, inscribed with runes and sigils, clearly marked it as a grimoire. I was just looking into the lore about river monsters. Handy to know. Didn't expect to need it quite so soon. He pushed his round glasses up on his nose. You don't happen to have any chocolate cake in that bag, do you? I'm feeling a bit peckish. George didn't move. Paul wasn't sure the taller man even heard him. Then again, when George meditated, he tuned everything out. Maybe today he was talking with the ghosts of ancient Romans, possible for a talented medium like George. Or perhaps he'd struck a chord on his sitar that opened his vibrational magic. John said George was odd because he was a magical, mystical warrior like the slayers of old. Paul knew some of that was true, but he thought it was more likely that George was just a bit touched in the head. Pete, the beagle, looked up from where he lay next to George. His nose twitched, scenting food. Tail wagging, he bounded over to greet Paul, not making any effort to hide his enthusiasm for the cake in the paper bag Paul carried. Paul sighed and produced a dog biscuit from his pocket, then scratched Pete behind the ears. "How's Pete?" he cooed. "Who's our best boy? Sure you are." He straightened and turned back to John. "Yeah, I brought you cake," Paul replied with fond annoyance and tossed the bag to John. "But take a look at the magazine. I think we've found ourselves another mystery." At that, Ringo maneuvered his train into the roundhouse, and George roused from his trance. "Give me a minute," George said, squinting. "I'll have a look if I can just find my damn glasses." "They're on your head," Paul pointed out helpfully, not for the first time. George reached up and patted his hair, then retrieved his spectacles with a sheepish grin and unfolded his lanky body from the lotus position, pausing to stretch and twist. The four men had been mates since childhood. They'd tried to start a band once, but it hadn't worked out. John and Paul worked days at Tesco in the meat department. Most nights they sang and played in the train station busking for coins. George studied with a Maharishi and cooked at an Indian restaurant. Ringo was in training with British Railways to be a conductor, but the shared passion that had bound them together since they were boys was the love of mysteries and the supernatural. "See any visions? Pick up any news from the other side?" John asked. His tone made the sincerity of his question clear. "Just one word," George replied, looking a bit rumpled, as he always did coming out of trance. "Walrus." Weird, huh? The other three gathered around Paul, peering over his shoulder at the glossy tabloid. "There's been plenty of mentions of the Mercy Monster over the years, Liverpool's very own version of Nessie," Paul read aloud. "But sightings have been scarce as late, and monster fans despaired that the River Mersey's famed sea monster might have moved on to new digs. But no less than 4 different barge sailors have reported seeing a strange creature in the shipping channel. Descriptions of a greenish-yellow, snake-like creature, only active at night, have local police and river authorities scratching their heads. Has our favorite monster finally awoken from its slumber?" "Not much to go on," Ringo said, before he meandered back to his train set. "Interesting," John mused. "It's worth looking into." George had a faraway look, as if he were listening to voices the rest of them couldn't hear. "We need to do this," he said, as his focus returned. "Whatever my vision meant, I think the Mercy Monster has something to do with it." Paul grinned. "Right then, how do you want to start?" George closed the grimoire and placed a set of blessed rosary beads on top to neutralize its energy. Best place to start with anything to do with the river is the history of the ship wing over at the National Museum of Liverpool. He glanced across the room. "Are you coming, Mr. Conductor? The train is leaving the station." Ringo rolled his eyes. "Don't be a git." He was the last to leave the flat as they trooped out. John's old blue Fiat had been tagged with graffiti so often it had a psychedelic look to it. They squeezed inside, even Pete, who crawled onto Paul's lap in the back seat, eagerly sniffing for signs of more food. "Bloody beagle," Paul said fondly. "The only thing you can find by scent is takeaway." Once they parked, John gestured for them to close in to strategize. George, you take Pete and stroll up and down the riverside. See if you can get any of the ghosts to talk to you or if Pete picks up on anything. Ringo, see if you can pick a lock or two and get down into the archives. There might be something about old monster sightings down there. If you get caught, just say you took a wrong turn. He glanced at Paul. You come with me. You can be looking into the Mercy Monster for a report you need to write for uni. I'll just follow in the wake of your overwhelmingly scally charm and see what the magic tells me. Paul led the way, relying on the smile that had opened doors for him his whole life. He knew how to work his boyish looks, and it had gotten him many a free pint or pasty when times were hard. He'd learned to be a bit posh about it, too, when the circumstances warranted. That had earned him the nickname of Sir Paul from his mates, which he didn't mind as much as he pretended. He'd heard worse on the rough streets growing up. A big smile and some banter not only got them directions to one of the staff members' offices, but also the telephone number of the receptionist. They cut across the display space, past several old ships and some antique navigational equipment. They keep talking about making a proper maritime museum on its own, Paul remarked. Wonder if they'll ever do it. Most of this stuff looks like it should have gone down with the Titanic, John replied, although I thought I saw something about them getting a research grant and one of those little submarines like the one the French guy has, Cousteau. There's a pirate room, Paul said. He veered in that direction. Hey, we've got work to do. We can spare a minute. It's pirates, John. Paul knew when he turned his pleading expression on John, it was like being the annoying little brother his friend couldn't deny. Oh, all right, but let's make it quick, John protested. Paul felt sure that beneath it he was just as eager. Who didn't like pirates? You know, pirates were really low-life bar scum, John said, as they walked through the exhibit. To Paul's dismay, the presentation lacked the flash and dash he associated with garish wax museum tableaus. Only one ratty-looking mannequin in a pirate costume presided over the exhibit, and something about the figure made Paul's skin crawl. John looked equally unsettled and kept his distance. No big surprise that the River Mercy was a smuggling roost way back when, Paul said, taking in the notes beside each item in the glass cases. Probably stayed that way long after anyone walked the plank. John didn't answer, and Paul turned to find him staring at an oil painting of a corpulent man in a fine brocade waistcoat that looked something like he might have lived during George III's time. Hey, mate, something wrong? Paul asked. This is Alfred Bascombe, the most famous pirate of the River Mercy, John said. He was known for being large, ill-tempered, and quick to start a fight. They called him the Walrus. Paul's eyes widened. Walrus, like from George's vision? Bit of a stretch for it not to be, don't you think? A scuffle in the corridor drew their attention. Paul and John moved closer, where they could see but were unlikely to be noticed. You've got no right. My research is the reason you've got this grant. Without me, this paltry excuse for a museum is nothing. A red-faced, middle-aged man confronted a slim, older man whose face showed absolutely no emotion. There's no need to make a scene, Mr. Masters. The board's word is final. I licked your boots to get this job, and for what? A crummy paycheck that barely pays for my flat, even with my degrees? This research paper would have made it all worthwhile, and now you're stealing it from me. No one has stolen anything, Mr. Masters. Your services are no longer needed. We'll see about that. You'll find out how much you need my help. Mark my words, you'll be sorry. Masters stomped off, leaving the thin man standing still and emotionless. A moment later, he walked to a wall phone. Miss Jenkins, there's been a problem with Oakley Masters. He's gotten a bit too emotional. Send security to escort him from the building. He listened for a moment, nodded, and hung up, then walked away without noticing Paul and John in the shadows. Well, that could have gone better, John observed. I wonder what all that was about. Paul hadn't thought that a museum offered much to get worked up over, but apparently he was wrong. I doubt it's anything to do with sea monsters. Come on, let's go see that guy your friend up front thought we should talk to. Paul led them out the other side of the display, toward the office of Cutler Wickles, the researcher that the receptionist had recommended. When they reached his half-open door, Paul ducked his head inside. Mr. Wickles, I'm Paul, doing some research for uni. Linda up front said you're the best person to talk to. Can you spare me a few? He flashed his most persuasive smile. Come in, can I help you? Cutler Wickles looked like an academic, from his tweed jacket to his tan pants and wing-tipped shoes. He might be in his 40s, blonde hair receding from his forehead, a bit of paunch in the middle. Wickles had obviously just been finishing his lunch because he pushed aside what smelled like a mutton sandwich in a bright red paper wrap. I'm doing a paper for a folklore class on the Mercy Monster, Paul said. I saw an article you wrote about it for one of the museum journals, and I hope you'd answer a few questions. Wickles' smile strained as a flash of annoyance crossed his feature. I hope you realize that the article I wrote about the Mercy monster spoke of it as legend, not fact, Wickles said, his tone less friendly and more professorial than a moment before. Yes, I do, I really do, Paul said, turning up the charm. But as my gran always said, where there's smoke, there's fire, right? I thought it was all just a story, but then I saw the newspaper article, and it made me wonder if the Mercy monster tales might have a grain of truth. Wickles rolled his eyes. You mean that rag, the Mercy Beasts magazine? Last week its headline read, Pirates Prove Liz is a Lizard, and before that, someone who claimed Jack the Ripper was an alien biologist from a UFO. So you don't think... I think we have no idea what lurks at the bottom of the Mercy and how all the pollution might affect creatures there, Wickles replied, surprising Paul. He twisted an antique ring on his right hand. A nervous habit. Paul thought the ring looked familiar, but he couldn't place it. I had been hoping that the research grant would let us get a look with the new submersible, but I don't think that's going to happen now. Why not? Paul asked. John stayed behind him, observing without drawing Wickles' notice. Wickles sighed. My esteemed colleague got his walking papers handed to him. Damn sundodger. I'm afraid museums aren't a good fit for former Navy men. Oakley Masters? Paul asked. How do you know? Wickles asked. We happened to overhear an altercation on our way here, Paul admitted, cringing. He was former Royal Navy? Submariner. That's why we got the grant and the use of the submersible. But there were some irregularities with his research, nasty allegations about footnotes and sources, and, well, he's no longer on staff. Can you or someone else run the sub? Seems like a real shame to miss out on a chance to find out if the Mercy monster is real, Paul replied. Me? Hardly. I'm not a Navy man. Far from it. Wayne Stillwell, the other researcher on staff, was a diver. In fact, I think he's already done some dives to find the monster. But can he drive the sub? No idea. Wickles crumpled up the remaining bits of his mutton sandwich in the wrapper and tossed it in the trash. Thank you for your time, Mr. Wickles, Paul said, giving his most sincere fake smile. Where can we find Mr. Stillwell? If he's in, he should be 3 doors to your left, but he's been out a lot lately, and he comes back to work at nights. Not sure why. Seems a bit odd, but I guess he has his reasons. They took their leave and headed for Stillwell's office, which was dark and locked. Guess we're out of luck, Paul said. Psst. Paul and John exchanged a glance, wondering where the noise had come from. Psst, over here. A hand stretched out of the janitor's closet, beckoning them to come closer. When they did, they found a white-haired man in a blue uniform jumpsuit standing in the mop room. I heard you talking to Mr. Wickles. You're investigating the monster? Paul nodded. Yes. Do you know something? The old man leaned far enough to check the hallway in both directions before he answered. Something funny is going on, and I think the monster is only part of the story. You want to know what I think? I think Alfred Bascom is back from the dead and back to his old ways. John answered before Paul thought of a reply. That's very interesting, Mr. Weatherby, Hank Weatherby. I've been with one part of this museum or another for 20 years, so you can believe me when I say this place is haunted. The ghost of Alfred Bascom has come back to claim his rightful place as the smuggler king of the River Mersey. Weatherby's pale blue eyes were wide, and the shock of white hair fell across his forehead as he leaned toward them in his fervor. Paul took a half step back, hard to do in the small utility closet. What makes you think so? Isn't it obvious? Things are going missing, pieces that used to belong to Bascom himself. Doors are locked, nobody broke in, but 5 pieces disappeared from the archive. Police found nothing. I'll tell you why, ghosts don't leave fingerprints. Weatherby ran a hand through his wild hair. And then there's the monster, showing up again. Stories said Bascom made a deal with the devil back in his day for a demon to protect his smuggling runs, and Satan himself raised a creature from the deep to be his watchdog. Only makes sense that if Bascom's ghost is back to his old ways, his pet monster would return to help him. Do you know what's gone missing? John asked. A sidelong glance made Paul wonder if his mate was actually taking the janitor's rant seriously. Sure I do. A couple of old navigational tools, a sextant and an astrolabe. Used them to navigate by the stars. They're gone. So's a spyglass, a quadrant, and an old sea clock. Who would want those things nowadays, besides the man they belong to? That's a very good question, Paul replied, although collectors seemed likely to find the missing items very interesting. Weatherby gave a curt nod. I might just be the sweep-up guy, but I know things. Mr. Pilchard doesn't realize I can do more than mop floors. Mr. Pilchard? The museum curator. He's the one who fired Oakley Masters. We overheard a bit of that by accident. Why did Masters get fired? Once again, Weatherby paused to check the hallway. They're saying he did bad research or some such, but that's not the real reason, the janitor said, pitching his voice low. Then why? Because he was trying to disprove the monster, and he didn't believe in the ghost of Alfred Bascombe. He paused. Stillwell's been acting dodgy, too. Mighty suspicious that he goes out diving at night with that weird light rig contraption just when people are starting to see the monster, don't you think? How do you know? Paul pressed. Weatherby gave him a look as if he were dim. I'm still around after all the toffs go home for the night, all Hank cleaning up the place. I've seen Stillwell in his diving gear when he thought everyone else was gone. He had words with Oakley Masters, too. Stillwell was arguing with him about using that little submarine to find the monster. Heard that dust up myself. What did they argue about? John sounded curious. You should see Stillwell's office. It's full of pictures and clippings about the Mercy monster and the old smugglers. Even has some of those cheap toys they sell on the waterfront to tourists, as if that's what the monster really looked like, he added with a sniff. So Stillwell's a believer? Paul found that particularly interesting after the discussion with Wickles. More than a believer, Weatherby confided. He's obsessed. Got in a fight with Masters because Stillwell thought Masters didn't want to prove that the monster existed. He gave a crafty smile. Nobody thinks twice about talking in front of old Hank, the janitor. I hear everything, he confided. Thank you, John said. You've been very helpful. Mind you, remember what I said about Alfred's ghost. He walks these halls, and he doesn't take kindly to doubters. With that ominous warning, Weatherby grabbed his mop and pushed past them, whistling as he walked down the hall. Paul and John stepped out of the closet and pushed the door shut behind them. I think it's time we caught up with George and Ringo, John said. This mystery just got a lot more mysterious. They met George and Ringo at Cosgood's bar, around the corner from the museum. Sitting at a cafe table out front allowed Pete to join them on a leash and under the table. So what did you find out? Paul said when they had ordered a round of pints. There's a room with diving gear and wetsuits that have been used recently, Ringo volunteered. The boss man had papers from a lawyer on his desk about some pieces that got stolen. One of the other offices is full of monster stuff, posters, pictures, you name it. And the thieves must have already taken the good stuff from the archive because there's nothing interesting left, just a bunch of old papers. And the submarine? John asked. For what I had in mind when you called it a sub, Ringo replied. For one thing, it's yellow, and it's about the size of your Fiat. I didn't try to jimmy the locks on it, didn't want it to sink. You still got the touch, Paul congratulated him. You bet your life I do. Did you know this place has a cephalopoda grotto? Ringo asked. Chock full of octopuses. I happened upon that in my travels. Knowing that Ringo liked octopuses almost as much as he liked trains, Paul doubted that finding the grotto was an accident. I had a little more luck, George replied. There were ghosts down by the riverside. Some of them were too scared to talk. They're afraid the walrus's ghost is back and just as bloodthirsty now as he was then. Some of the others had a bone to pick with the walrus, and they say he rides a yellow beast with red eyes that he got in a bargain with the devil. Paul and John exchanged a glance. That's creepy, John said. Even weirder because we got a similar story from the janitor. I also got talking to a guy, Steve Magnus, George continued, owns a tugboat, so he's up and down the Mersey all the time. Says there's been a new wave of smuggling in the last 6 months after it had died down for a long while. Cigarettes and alcohol, but he says he heard lately that they've moved up to bigger things. Didn't know what. Score one for the Walrus, John muttered. Did Pete turn up anything? Paul glanced at the happy-go-lucky dog that was munching on a cold potato crisp that he had found on the ground. Pete turned up sandwich wrappers, George said. He found them near the museum and by the waterfront. What kind of sandwich? Paul looked up sharply. Does it matter? It might. George sighed. I wouldn't know, except he got part of an actual sandwich, and I was afraid it might make him sick. At least that one looked like mutton. Wickles had a mutton sandwich when we talked to him, Paul said. Lots of people probably have mutton sandwiches, John argued. I bet there's a mutton sandwich shop nearby, which is where Wickles got his lunch. Well, Pete has a new favorite, George said. I've never seen him wolf down anything like he did with that mutton. Wanted to eat the wrapper, too. So where does that leave us? Ringo asked and sipped his ale. Because if we're not going to solve this mystery, my buzz has worn off, and I'd like to do something about that. Your shrooms will wait, George replied. You and Johnny get your high off magic, Ringo replied. Paul gets his from conning his marks. Pete eats. Don't hate my shrooms. They make the colors sing and the octopuses talk to me. You're an odd duck, George told him, says the man who talks to ghosts. So what now? Paul asked. Elementary, my dear penguin, George answered. We'll come back tonight and catch a ghost, a pirate, and a smuggler. Maybe all three in one, he added with a mysterious glint in his eye. How did you get Linda to let us in after hours? John asked as they moved through the darkened museum. She's scared of the ghost, Paul replied. I told her we could take care of that for her, and she's not just a receptionist. Her father's the museum's major donor and the chairman of the board, so there's that if we get caught. Good to know, George said. He glanced at the others, even Pete, who wagged enthusiastically. You know the plan? Pete and I are the decoys, Ringo said. We stick around the sub and get our man to chase us up here. I'll drop the fishing net on him, John said, glancing toward the ceiling where they'd rigged a big net on a pulley from the exhibit hall ceiling. And I'll do the unmasking while you play your sacred chord and nab the ghost, Paul recapped, with a nod toward the harmonica that poked out of George's shirt pocket. Places, everybody, George said with a grin. We've got a ghost smuggler to catch. They waited in the darkness. Time crawled by. Paul blended in with the shadows, waiting for his cue. Across the room, John was almost invisible in the darkness where the pulley rope to the net was tied off, ready for when his moment came. Paul guessed the ceiling rig was intended for banners or hanging exhibit pieces, but in a pinch, it worked for a ghost trap. George was in position next to the oil painting of Alfred Bascombe. Running footsteps and Pete's frantic barking broke the dead silence of the darkened museum. Paul tensed, ready to spring. Cutler Wickles burst into the room with Pete and Ringo hard on his heels. John let go of the rope, sending the net crashing to the floor, missing Wickles and trapping Ringo. Pete launched himself at Wickles and knocked him to the ground, vigorously licking at the man's hands and mouth for the last taste of mutton sandwich. Get this mutt off of me, Wickles shouted. Paul and John ran toward their quarry, tying Wickles' wrists and ankles. Pete gave the prisoner a disappointed final glance and walked away in disgust as he found no mutton. I'll have you arrested. This is assault, Wickles fumed. Paul moved back to his position as George blew a strange and sacred chord on the harmonica, gathering his power as a medium and summoning the ghost of Alfred Bascombe. Mutineers, the ghost pirate raged. I'll kill all the lot of you. Not this time, Walrus. Paul reached for the head of the pirate mannequin and pulled off the plastic features, revealing a yellowed skull beneath. Go away, ghost pirate, he said, squirting the skull with lighter fluid and setting it on fire with his Zippo. Bascombe's angry spirit shrieked and flailed, but the fire that consumed his bones tore through the apparition as well, until he vanished with a final rage-filled scream. How did you know? Wickles' voice held both disdain and curiosity. I knew I'd seen that ring before, Paul replied, nodding to the one on Wickles' hand. I just couldn't remember where. It's the same one Bascombe was wearing in the portrait. His ghost led me to it. He wanted me to have it, Wickles sulked. It was mine, fair and square. He wanted you to have it because that was how he controlled you, George said. Bascombe's angry spirit was trapped here because of his bones and the painting. Since he had to stick around, he wanted back in the smuggling game, but he needed a body to do it, so he used yours. You told a good story when John and I went to talk to you. Paul looked away from the charred mannequin. But you gave yourself away. You said you weren't a Navy man, but you called Masters a sun dodger. That's Navy slang for submariner. And the mutton sandwich wrappers we found around the sub proved you'd been near there, Ringo said. Pete loves mutton, so when he smelled it on you, the hunt was on. You started smuggling 6 months ago, not long after Masters brought in the Grant and the sub, George went on, as Wickles scowled. Cigarettes and alcohol from bigger ships offshore. You used the sub to take the cargo up the river where your fence was waiting. And in the process, some of the locals got glimpses of the yellow submarine, but you fed that story about the sea monster to the Mercy Beast magazine, so nobody would suspect what you were really doing, Paul chimed in. But that wasn't enough, George added. You were afraid Masters might catch on, so you had to get rid of him. So you faked evidence that he'd done bad research to get him fired. You weren't worried about Wayne Stillwell because he wanted to believe in the monster so much he'd be the first to take sides against Masters. But you didn't count on Hank Weatherby, the janitor, seeing and hearing so many things, John said, as he helped Ringo out from under the net. In the meantime, you and Bascombe wanted more. So you started stealing relics out of the archive room and fencing them to collectors, George accused. It was a nice little racket, while it lasted. I've got money. I can pay you all to forget this. Paul glanced at his mates. They all shook their heads, even Pete, as if he understood the question. Sorry, no, we solve mysteries, and it looks like we've wrapped up another one. Wickles glared at them. I had it all under control, and I would have gotten away with it too if it weren't for you meddling lads from Liverpool. Did you see the cover of the Mercy Beast magazine? Paul careened into their flat, nearly tripping over George's sitar in one of Ringo's trains. Look at this! He held out the new issue for them all to see. Fab 4 Nab Walrus Ghost and Mercy Monster. There they were in full color, right on the cover, and Pete too. We're famous. Plus, we got a reward for catching Wickles and tipping the police off to the stolen relics, John pointed out. And we didn't get arrested, George noted, which is a win. Linda came through for us like I said she would, Paul replied with a grin. I still wish ghost hunting paid better, Ringo lamented as his model train gave a mournful whistle. The only thing that pays worse is playing in a band. That's my story, The Walrus Returns, and it is part of the Across the Universe anthology from Fantastic Press. I'm Gail Z. Martin, and I hope you enjoyed the story.